And welcome to a Climate Conversation podcast. This podcast series is a complement to a Climate Conversation movie, and you can watch that for free at climateconversation.com. And it's the project of Walt Johnson. He's a geophysicist, has been in the business for over 50 years and done amazing work in this arena. But he wanted to create a documentary to just have a conversation, Socratic method, questioning about this whole narrative on climate. And so, Walt Johnson, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for your amazing work and dedication to this particular subject.
Thanks to all of you for all your work.
And our spokesman for a climate conversation is Dave O'Rourke. He hails from California, and this has been quite the journey for you, Dave O'Rourke.
It has, and it's brought me to this wonderful moment today. I've been very much looking forward to our conversation with Lord Monckton. It's an honor and a privilege to be on this podcast with you all. I'm excited. I've got my seatbelt on.
You need it.
Fun.
And our guest today is Lord Christopher Monckton. And Lord Monckton, how should we introduce you?
Well, this is very, very simple, Kim. You go down on one knee, put on your white gloves, bow low, touch your forelock, if you've got one, which the other two guests on here don't seem to have, so they would end up in the Tower of London. And then you address me as follows. You say, "My lord, would you be so gracious as to allow this rebellious colonial to address your lordship?" And then we'll get on just fine.
Got it. Okay, consider it done. How's that?
Marvelous. In that case, you can just call me Christopher from now on. It makes it much easier.
Okay. We will do that. So, Dave O'Rourke, where should we start with all of this?
As is usual with our podcast, I always think that setting the table with some background, personal background about how we got here. So, Christopher, you've had decades in this conversation of activity. You've been very involved in the conversation all over the world. Can you tell us how this began for you and what got you here? What piqued your interest in the first place in the climate conversation?
Well, the first indication I ever got that there might be something wrong with the official narrative was when I read a book by the late Michael Crichton, who had looked into this subject in some detail. It was a novel, and he set the novel on the basis that an environmental organization that was promoting this nonsense decided to trigger an artificial earthquake and would then blame that on global warming. And so it was a rattling good yarn, as all of Michael Crichton's books were. Of course, he was the originator, among other things, of Jurassic Park and all the dinosaur stories. So he was a very, very famous author. And I, in fact, had a conversation with him shortly before he died, because he'd seen an article I'd written in 2006 in our big national Sunday newspaper, the Sunday Telegraph, and had rung up to say how much he agreed with what I'd said, because I had said that I had recently been asked by a hedge fund to look into whether global warming really was going to be a problem or whether it wasn't. And I had originally told them, yes, of course it is. Then I began looking, found Michael Crichton's book, began making contact with scientists from both sides. And the scientists on the skeptical side, if I asked them what was then a naive layman's question about some aspect of climate science, they would reply and say, "Oh, well, you need to speak to this person or read that paper, or here's the appropriate equation, or here's the diagram you want." And they would explain. And they clearly had nothing to hide and were very friendly and helpful. But whenever I rang somebody from the other side and said, "I don't quite understand how you think that this works or why you think that that's a problem," or whatever, they would say, every time this happened, "You should not be asking any questions at all about this. This is settled science. You're not allowed to question it. You just have to start from the position that the world's scientific community has decided that climate change is the worst problem in history, and everything else must be subservient to it, and you must not ask any further questions." And I thought, well, that is a totalitarian form of reply. And so when the I had done a report for the hedge fund that had asked me to look at this. It was 80 pages. And I said, among other things, I'd spoken to people on both sides, and the people on the what one might call the climate communist side, with more than a little justification. They always wouldn't answer my questions. They just said, you should not be asking any questions about any of this. And that is a totalitarian response. That's not how science works. Science works by having open discussions following the scientific method, which was invented by Thales of Miletus in the 5th and 6th centuries BC, and was then most beautifully expressed by Abu Ali ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Haytham, who was the Newton of the East in the Cairo of the 11th century at the height of the Abbasid dynasty, which was a strikingly enlightened Muslim dynasty, which allowed freedom of thought, freedom of discussion, and even freedom of religion. It's just about the only Islamic society that's ever allowed that. As a result, the sciences flourished under that dynasty in Damascus and in Baghdad and in Al-Ahira, which we now call Cairo. And this was the center of the intellectual world. The Muslims were, their scholars were streets ahead of anything that was then happening in the West. We were in the Dark Ages, and they were in the golden age of Islamic scholarship. And there's a most wonderful quote from Al-Haytham about how the seeker after truth, as he describes the scientist, the seeker after truth, does not pay unquestioning deference to his venerable scientific antecedents, even though he respects them. Instead, he questions everything that they tell him and subjects it to intensive scrutiny and checking and checking and checking again. He said, the road to the truth is long and hard, but that is the road we must follow. And to this day, I think Al-Haytham's statement about what the scientific method is the best, most eloquent, most forceful, and most moral statement of the scientific method that I've ever come across. He's justly celebrated in a number of Arab countries today with his image on their stamps and on their banknotes. He's perhaps the foremost scientist that the Muslim world has ever produced. And reading his writings is absolutely fascinating. So when I began finding that there was this intellectual tradition of the scientific method, which nicely bridges what is now the painful divide between the East and the West, between the Muslims and the Judeo-Christian tradition, I was very excited by this. And so I wrote my report to the hedge fund that had consulted me and said, look, I was wrong when I told you that, of course, the science is settled on this, because it plainly isn't. Indeed, there's no such thing as settled science. I've now been properly educated by various skeptical scientists, and I have accepted that my original position was wrong. And therefore, this report is explaining why the official position is wrong. And about 2 weeks later, the manager of this hedge fund got in touch, and he said, why should I believe a word you say? And I said, well, you should have thought of that before you commissioned me. But now that you have commissioned me, I'm going to say that I have explained what I think is the real science and the real economics of this. If there's anything in my report that you think shouldn't be there, or anything that you think is wrong, tell me and we can have a conversation about it. If there's anything I've left out that you think should be there, tell me. We can have a conversation about that. Otherwise, that's my best shot. Exactly, he said. He said, we've consulted a dozen experts, of whom you are by far the least eminent. He said, I said, thank you for that. And he said, but the only one of the 12 experts that we have consulted who provided any evidence was you. And all the others told me what they all told you. You shouldn't be asking any questions about this. Only you said, well, I think this is a problem, but I will check. And then you checked and you changed your mind and you gave us 80 pages of evidence. So we're going with you. We're pulling all our clients out of so-called green investments. And sure enough, ever since then, even with the massive governmental subsidies that are poured into so-called green corporations, they are all hugely loss-making and have shown continuous decline ever since then, Whereas if you'd put your money in the stock market in general, you'd have made approximately a happy 5% a year. So green investments were a bad idea. And the moment they knew that global warming wasn't really a problem, they said, right, we're not playing anymore. We're not going to put our clients into any green investments anymore, unless they particularly insist that we should. And we will warn them of the dangers you've warned us of, which is that eventually this storyline is going to collapse. When it collapses, there's going to be egg over the faces of all of those politicians and other useful idiots, as Lenin used to describe them, who have gone along with the Communist Party line on the climate when it turns out to be based on a horrendous scientific mistake. So that's how I got into this, and that's what I did about it.
What a wonderful story. If I could just follow up, Kim, briefly. There's a saying in American legal system that when you're weak on the law, you argue the facts. And when you're weak on the facts, you argue the law. And when you're weak on the law and the facts, you attack the prosecution.
That's right.
Your sobriquet on your wonderfully long and interesting Wikipedia page is the Lord of the Lies. And I just think if I could have a nickname as wonderful as that, that would be the end.
Well, the Wikipedia page, Wikipedia is run by an outfit which was founded by a pornographer. He made his money out of pornography. And I got to speak to him because when they first began messing up my Wikipedia page and making me look like some kind of cross between an idiot and a lunatic, I spoke to them. I said, this won't do. And I ended up speaking to him. I don't know how I got through to him because he doesn't like people speaking to him, but I got through to him. And I said, look, mate, this won't do. You know, it's inaccurate and it's been very carefully twisted so as to leave out the other side of the story. And for instance, one of the things they amuse themselves doing is to say that I'm not a real lord, that I made all that up and I don't have a seat in the House of Lords and I go around giving myself airs and graces and it's all nonsense. And the clerk of the Parliament has wrote a letter saying that I was not a lord and all this kind of thing. And so as an experiment, I got hold of a legal opinion that I had been offered by a barrister for nothing. An eminent barrister in London. When I came, I tell you the story of how this whole thing about the House of Lords came about. I was on a speaking tour of Australia, and my minders there had lined up for me to do a debate in the press club in Canberra, the Australian press club, against a climate communist who actually was a communist. He presided over a communist front institution called the Australia Institute. And it sounds innocent, as most of these communist fronts do, but it is a communist front institution. And I knew this because only a week or two beforehand, I'd been walking around a park in Sydney, and a messy woman came up to me and said, oh, would I give money to the Australia Institute? And I said, no, because it's a communist front organization. She said, no, it isn't. I said, well, let me put it this way. You're a communist, aren't you? Oh, yes, she said. And I said, well, there you are then. I said, we know of your institute. It is a communist front. Fair enough. You're entitled to be a communist in a free country. If you were in a communist country, you would not be free to be a conservative. You'd have to be a communist. We have the freedom here. Enjoy your freedom. But don't ask me to give you money to support communism. And she said, why not? I said, because communism has killed between 100 million and 250 million people within my lifetime. And I said, that is more people that have been killed by any regime of any stamp, and all of them added together throughout human history. It is a uniquely terrible totalitarian regime, and you should have nothing to do with it. Well, anyway, a few weeks later, there I was on the stage in the press club being filmed live by ABC, which is another communist front organization, and they were filming this debate between me and the head of the Australia Institute, this communist, and he made a complete fool of himself. And they knew that he was going to, because he knew what the party line was, but he didn't know any science. So he didn't know why the party line was the party line. He didn't know how to defend it. And when they realized that, a couple of days before the debate, they got in touch with a communist in the House of Lords who was called the Clerk of the Parliament. His name was Beamish, and he was a highly political figure who pretended not to be. And they said, we need help here. We've got to trash Monckton's reputation because he's going to knock our communist all over the park in this very public, widely broadcast debate on, the main channel of Australian television, broadcast at lunchtime, repeated in the evening and several times the following year. So he said, we really need to trash his reputation. Can you help? So Beamish, ghastly little man, he's now been got rid of. He wrote a letter to me, ostensibly to me, saying I should not go around calling myself a lord. And this was all completely improper, and I had no right to do that. And he didn't send the letter to me. He sent it to the press. And they immediately got in touch with me and said, what's all this about you not being a lord? And I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about initially. And then eventually I got in touch with the Clerk of the Parliament. So I said, what the hell is going on? They then rather shamefacedly sent me the ghastly Beamish's letter. And I saw what they'd done. So sure enough, during the debate, the first question by the various lefty journalists who were sitting in the room was from a young whippersnapper who said, oh, now, Lord Monckton, I'm not even sure whether I should call you Lord Monckton because the Clerk of the Parliament says you're not a lord. So what do you say to that? So I said, I'm not here to debate the arcana of peerage law. I'm here to debate climate change. I quite understand that after the performance of my opponent in this debate, you would wish to try to trash my reputation, but in that you will fail. And I explained that I have letters patent from Her late Majesty, which say that I have a seat, a vote, and a voice in the House of Lords. And it comes in a great big red briefcase it's wider than I can hold my hands up on this screen. And it's beautifully illuminated, and it's got the Queen's sign manual. She signed it herself. And that was given to my grandfather. My father inherited it from him. I inherited it from my father. I am therefore a lord. And I explained all this. I said, I don't actually have the seat, vote and voice in the House that the Queen promised because the communist government of Tony Blair took the right of the hereditary peers, as we're called, to sit or vote in the House of Lords. But we are still members of the House of Lords. That doesn't change. And so he tried to interrupt, and I said, no, you had your chance and you blew it. You could have talked about the subject of this debate, but no, your brief was to try to destroy my reputation. You failed. Now sit. And you can see this on YouTube because somebody filmed it all. This poor little kid sort of collapsed into his chair looking dazed. And even the lefty press said at the end of that hour-long debate that I had won it by a country mile. But ever since then, the left have had huge fun, and Wikipedia, they won't correct this. But when I got back to the UK, it was hilarious. The next thing that happened was a solicitor got in touch, and he said, I can act as your intermediary with a barrister. We have these two kinds of lawyer. And you have to talk to a solicitor, and he then finds a barrister for you. And he said, we were so shocked by the misbehavior of the Clerk of the Parliament, this dreadful Beamish, that we are going to give you a free legal opinion on whether you are or are not a member of the House of Lords. So I went to some immensely swank barristers' chambers overlooking the Thames. A few days later, with the solicitor, he introduced me to the barrister. He was a very, very learned man. His specialty was peerage law, as it's called, the law of who's a lord and who isn't, and that sort of thing. And so he produced a wonderful 11-page opinion, which ends up with the words, and therefore the Viscount Monckton is, as he says he is, a member of the House of Lords, albeit, as he says, not entitled to sit or vote therein, and he is fully entitled to say so. And just recently, the new Clerk of the Parliament decided he thought he would try to get smart. Again, presumably the communists had got in touch and said, we need a bit more help. And so I wrote a really crushing letter back saying, here is that opinion. put that in your pipe and smoke it. I do not expect to hear from you again. And if you do, I shall petition the king for your removal from your post for playing politics. Now shut up and good day. I haven't heard from them since. And when I got onto Wikipedia, I thought, well, I'll just put up on the talk page associated with my page the entire text of this 11 pages. I just pasted it in. Within 20 minutes, it was gone. Because Wikipedia doesn't want debates on this. They just want to blacken the reputations of anyone who on this or any other subject does not reflect the Communist Party line. And one of the things that the creaky and, alas, rather useless Conservative government that's just been voted out in this country was going to do was to try to guarantee the free speech, which in the United States is guaranteed by your Constitution, and which has been more or less completely lost in Britain. We are no longer a free country here. But the first thing that the communist government that was voted in did was to remove that bill from the chain of bills, and now free speech will no longer be granted to us. We now have to toe the Communist Party line or else.
So, Lord Monckton, Christopher, excuse me. So what about what else? What else for you?
Well, what I'm now working on is, because we want to bring this sort of towards the climate debate again, I think, is some research which my team, I have 1,000 scientists at my back. We're called the Climate Intelligence Group. And it was founded by a Dutch scientist. And I'm one of the British ambassadors to this group. And we work together on a variety of scientific projects. And one of mine in particular is to look at whether global warming really is a problem. And that is a question which turns out to expect the answer no. And what happened was that climate scientists, we discovered, had at a vital point in their calculations simply forgotten that the sun was shining. Now, Walt Johnson is sort of looking daggers at me at the moment because he's a geophysicist, so he will know what I'm talking about when I say that the direct warming that would be caused by, say, doubling the CO2 in the air, or the direct warming caused by all the various changes in greenhouse gases that we might cause over the whole of the 21st century, and those two quantities are about the same, that would only cause directly 1 degree of warming. That's in Celsius. It'd be about 1.8 Fahrenheit, not really very much. But in order to make it look like maybe 3 Celsius, 4 Celsius, 5 Celsius, they imagine that all the rest of the warming that they predict above that direct 1 Celsius, which broadly speaking everyone can agree on, comes from what is called feedback response. Now, feedback in a dynamical system, which is a system like the climate, which changes its state over time, is where if you give it a direct stimulus, such as warming the air a little bit with putting some greenhouse gases into it, then more water vapor will accumulate in the atmosphere. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, but just because the atmosphere gets warmer, it can hold more water vapor, and that is known as a feedback response. And what the climatologists said was, oh, well, the feedback response is going to be 2, 3, 4, or even 5 times that 1 Celsius of direct warming per doubling of CO2 or per all our influence on the climate over the 21st century. And that's how they get from a small, harmless, and so far strongly net beneficial global warming to this enormous 3 to 4 to 5 Celsius larger warming that even then probably wouldn't do much damage, but of course they can at least pretend that that might somehow cause harm. And it's this feedback response that they say is bound to cause really severe global warming unless we shut down the West, and significantly the West alone, which begins to give you an indication of where all this climate change rubbish is actually being driven from. It's being driven from the communist East. And I can go into more detail about that later if you like, but just sticking to the science for a moment. So what they did was they forgot, when they were doing their calculation of how big this feedback response, which is where they think up to 80% of the warming comes from, would be, they left out the fact that the sun which is up there all the time, except in Scotland, of course. It may be that all the climatologists are Scottish and they don't see the sun, so they forget it. But they forgot that the sun itself causes nearly all of the feedback response in the climate. They left that out. And because they left it out, they attributed all the feedback response in the climate to the changes in greenhouse gas concentrations. And that's why they ended up thinking there would be a large amount of warming, which, as it happens, isn't happening. The world is warming at the rate that you would expect if you corrected their error, included the sunshine in the calculation, and therefore attributed to the greenhouse gases a much smaller feedback response than they imagine, because the rest of the feedback response comes from the sun. It's nothing to do with us. So this is a very huge mistake. Now, let me just ask Walt here, does what I have said make, at least superficially, some kind of apparent sense? Obviously, I'll send you the detailed paper afterwards, but just to get an idea, does it sound like gibberish to you, or does it sound plausible?
It sounds good, because in life, all of life, we see feedback in everything.
That's right. Now, feedback was originally developed in the 1920s and 30s in New York by Bell Labs. And there was a guy there called Harold S. Black, and he lived in Hoboken, New Jersey. And I don't know whether you've ever been to Hoboken, New Jersey, but it has the most magnificent railway and ferry terminal. Beautiful neoclassical building, which, unlike the original wonderful Penn Central Station in New York, is also neoclassical, which was torn down in an act of appalling vandalism about 40 years ago. It's all still there. Well, he sailed on the ferry, the Lackawanna Ferry, it's called, wonderful name, from Hoboken. And this was on the 7th of August in 1927. He was sailing across to the offices of Bell Labs, which were then in New York. And he was trying to work out in his mind as he went across the crossing how he could solve the biggest problem in telecommunications in those days, because they'd just been building the first telephone lines that went right across the United States. And the problem was that you had to have booster signals every few miles, because otherwise the signal would attenuate beyond the point where you could hear anything. But the trouble with the booster signals is that they were boosting not just the voices, but they were voice, which is known as the signal, what you're trying to transmit, but also the noise, which is the crackles on the line, because the circuits weren't perfectly built. And, there were birds doing things on the line or whatever. And so they had to find a circuit that would somehow distinguish between the voices, the signal, and these awful cracklings, which were preventing anyone from hearing what's coming out the other end. And so he realized you could build a thing called a negative feedback amplifier, which would apply a very large negative feedback to the circuit. And that would, in a way that I don't fully understand, because it's voodoo to me, it would suppress the crackling sounds, but it would allow the voices to go through uninterrupted. And this worked brilliantly. And on his copy of the New York Times that day, he drew the sketch of the circuit and he wrote the notes of the relevant equations. And when he got into New York, he realized how important what he discovered was. And he went straight to his boss and said, countersign this and date it and keep it on the files of the company, because this establishes our priority in this idea. And then we must immediately work on it, develop it, and then as soon as we're ready, apply for a patent. And within a year or two, they were ready to apply for a patent for how feedback mathematics works. And that was where the science of what is now called control theory first, which is the theory of feedback in dynamical systems, first arose. And so they went to the patent office when they were ready and they said, here is this idea. And the patent offices, both in London and in New York, turned them down. No, we're not going to give you a patent for this because it can't possibly work. So eventually, Harold S. Black, who wrote all this up in his biography in a paper in the 1970s, I think, explaining all this, he said, we took the patent officer by the scruff of the neck and we took him to the Central Telephone Exchange in New York, where there were more than 70 of these feedback amplifiers actually operating. And it was only when he saw that they were doing what it said on the tin and in the patent application that he granted the patent. And so what that tells you is that the mathematics of feedback is enormously counterintuitive. It's not something obvious. You look at a feedback circuit, you think, well, why the hell does that work? And it took me years to work it out. And I discovered that it was Archimedes who had made the first breakthrough when he had been trying to find the area under a parabola, which is a particular curve. It's one of the three elliptical curves. And you can draw an arbitrary line across this kind of bowl-shaped curve at any angle, and then you can work out the area using Archimedes' method, which involved the summation of an infinite series of powers. And it turns out that that summation of an infinite series of powers that Archimedes had first instanced the closed form sum of, so you don't have to add them all up, you can just use a little formula and it gives you the answer straight away. That is the same sequence of powers as what a feedback amplifier does. It's the same sequence of powers. And nobody in control theory knows this because they don't know any classical mathematics, nor do most of them know any number theory, so they don't realize that in modern times, the first of all the sums of series that has what's called a closed form sum, a simple formula rather than having to add up all the numbers from here to infinity, was that particular series. And so once you understand that that's how a feedback circuit works, then it becomes immediately comprehensible. And you can then see exactly why it is that the climatologists, who in my experience are knuckle dragging, they know very little mathematics or physics, they know no control theory at all, they just screwed up. And they didn't realize that the input signal, the base signal, is amplified by the feedback block in the circuit no less than any change in that signal that you cause, as we do in changing the sunshine signal by adding some greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So they didn't understand what the heck they were doing. So then we tried to get a paper published on this, and the first indication of our result, which we hadn't yet then finally formalized, but the Chinese Academy of Sciences got in touch and said, would I write a paper for them? So I did, and that went, we did a paper on that, and it was published in January 2015. And that now, by a factor of 12, I think it is the most downloaded paper in the entire 70-year history of the Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, because people are so fascinated. And we had a single paragraph in there saying, oh, well, there's something wrong with the way they do with feedback. We hadn't quite nailed down what it was at that time. And literally about a year after that, we found out what the mistake was. And ever since then, we've been trying to get that paper published. And the reviews of it are very silly because the climatologists who review it say, well, we don't understand the control theory, and so it can't be wrong because we've all been doing it this way, and so how can it be wrong? They can't actually meet the scientific argument at all. And then if they occasionally show it to a control theorist, he'll say, well, I can't understand the climatology, so I can't really say whether this is right or wrong. So we can't get it published because it falls between two scientific stools. But the error is so elementary that you can, and I have, you can actually explain this to high school students. And you can show them the few very simple equations which show what a huge cock-up they've made, and the kids get it straight away. And I was asked to do this by the head of the intelligence service in Colombia, whose brother was a teacher in a school there. He said, come down and give a talk to the James Bonds, which I did, just on how you take a subject that is not your own subject and then analyze it successfully so that you can advise your government on it. Because if you're cut off in the field somewhere, you can't always go to the experts. You have to form a judgment there and then advise your government on what it may have to do very quickly. You have to have some way of getting it right. So I took climate change as the example of this and said, here is, there was a particular thing called the hockey stick graph, which was plainly bogus. And I said there were two competing positions in science. One was the previous position, which didn't have a sharp uptick in temperatures at this end of the scale. It was much more of an uptick in the medieval warm period. And then there's this bogus curve which wiped out the medieval warm period. Which of those is right? I'm not an expert in the field. So I told them how I found out. And they were so fascinated by this that the director of the school actually gave me the Intelligence Medal of the Army of Colombia for this talk, because he was so intrigued that I'd shown them how you can use logic so as to come to a conclusion on a matter in which you're not yourself an expert. He found that really interesting, because that's the biggest problem in intelligence gathering, that you have to be able to do that. And so then I gave a talk also at a high school in Colombia, because the head of intelligence's brother was the teacher there. And so I gave a 40-minute talk, but I took a vote at the beginning. I said, how many of you think climate change is a problem? And about half the hands went up. And I said, what that tells me is that you have been fairly and honestly taught. You've been taught both sides of the argument. So half of you are one way and half of you are the other. That's as it should be, I said. But at the end of my talk, I said, right, now, how many of you think that global warming caused by us is or was or ever could be a problem? Not a single hand went up, because the moment these high school kids had understood the elementary mathematics of it, they could see for themselves the whole thing's nonsense. And so what is now going on is a battle between my team and the rest of the scientific community, which is utterly determined that it will not admit its error. Can you imagine how embarrassing it would be for all these people who make their fortunes out of rabbiting on about climate change on YouTube? One thinks of Sabine Hossenfelder from Germany, who's always, she's recently tried to attack a blameless Nobel physicist called John Clauser, who had dared to question the climate narrative. And so this insignificant woman decided that she would attack this eminent scientist in the most vicious way. She reflected the party line faithfully, because she has no idea how control theory works. She hadn't the faintest idea what she was talking about. And then you get that nitwit Neil deGrasse Tyson, who appears on every sort of scientific podcast, and he witters on about climate change. Again, he knows absolutely nothing about it except what the Communist Party line is. Now, these people would be utterly destroyed if our result were ever published. And so now they've actually circulated 2 blacklists of names of scientific researchers who are not to be published, so that editors, reviewers are warned to check the list. If your name is on that list and they're good little faithful communists, they will find a way of shutting down and refusing to review favorably any paper that we submit. So the entire system of peer review has become corrupted. But the thing is, by basing the climate narrative on an elementary scientific mistake, they have made themselves a strategic error. Yes, they've very successfully done huge damage to the Western economies by saying it's only the West that's got to clean up its act because we have a climate debt to the rest of the world. And sure enough, the effect of that has been to increase electricity prices in America to 3 or 4 times what they are in Russia, China, India, or Pakistan, the 4 communist-dominated economies of the East. And in Britain, it's 6 or 7 times the price of electricity in the communist bloc. And of course, that means every business that does any manufacturing and needs a lot of power is getting up and going. Our last steelworks in Britain is just closing down because it can no longer afford the electricity, which is expensive simply and solely because of the crippling expense of messing around with the grid so as to make it ready for net zero emissions. So what is the effect of net zero emissions? Let's move on, if you like, from the science to the economics of all this. So the first, imagine you're Tom Sawyer. You've all read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain. And it's a most charming book, and they made it in the 1960s, I think, or 50s, 1950s, into a very charming film, which you should see if you haven't. But you can imagine Tom Sawyer, who was a mischievous lad, just like me when I was a kid. And, you know, his mum gave him a wee handful of coins to go to the sweetie shop and buy himself some sweeties. So he goes into the window and he sees there some candy canes. So he goes into the shop and he says, slaps his sticky coins on the counter. And he says, gee, miss, how many candy canes can I get from this? Because he knew, as every small boy, that I asked the same question when I was given what was then 2 shillings by my beloved mother, now Mary in heaven, and I went to the sweetie shop and I spent all 2 shillings, and I came away with an enormous amount of candy as a result. And I was very pleased that 2 shillings would in those days buy you so much. It wouldn't now, obviously, but it did then. And my mother was furious because she said, "This is a terrible waste of money. You've spent it all on sweeties." I said, "No, I've learnt to my great pleasure just how much money, how much you can buy with how little money. And that means it's important for me to save." So she was, now you see, if a kid, I thought it was quite a good way of getting out from a whipping. But anyway, so if even a kid could work out the central question in economics, which is, if I spend some money, how much am I going to get in return for it? Don't you think that governments ought to have asked that question too? If we do get to net zero by their target year of 2050, moving in a straight line from our current sins of emission to zero net sins of emission by 2050, by how much would the global temperature be less in their target year than it is today, or than it would otherwise be, rather, if we did nothing? It would be a bit higher than it is now. If we did nothing, what would the difference be? And the difference, even if we are wrong about the feedback analysis I've already talked about, is 1/5 of a Celsius degree, less than half a degree Fahrenheit. And if we're right, then it's less than 1/10 of a Celsius degree. That's if the whole world went to nut zero, as we call it in Britain, by 2050. So what the heck is the point? That's not going to make any difference if the temperature was really going to climb to these astronomical levels they keep pretending, but it's not happening anyway. So that would be all the candy canes that you spend on trying to stop global warming would achieve. Probably 1/10 of a Celsius degree. Now, no government anywhere in the world has ever before asked that question. And so we asked that question. We worked out the answer. It's not a difficult one. So then we said, all right, what would it cost the world if the whole world went to nut zero by 2050? And the answer is, it would cost $2 quadrillion. How do we know? Because the one honest figure that was ever derived in the question of how much is this going to cost was done by the British National Electricity Grid Authority, which produced a report 2 years ago saying that just to nut zeroize the British grid alone would cost $15.8 trillion, just shy of $16 trillion, just for the electricity grid. So you then multiply all that up. So I think it was 3.8 trillion, to be fair, because then it's 16 trillion if you reckon that the grid is only a quarter of the whole emissions from the UK. So it's 16 trillion for the UK. That works out at 2 quadrillion for the whole world. But the cost, 2 quadrillion, and all you're buying for that is this 1/10 of a degree Celsius. So that means every $1 billion of your taxpayers' money that you squander on the Inflation Reduction Act to build more of these damn fool windmills and solar panels. Windmills, for heaven's sake. 14th century technology to address a 21st century non-problem expensively and incompetently. I mean, why on earth would you do that? But even if you did, you would have to if you, every billion that you spent on trying to buy net zero would buy you a reduction in temperature by 2050 of 1/20,000,000th of a Celsius degree. And that's how little the return on your investment would be. It's the worst value for money in history, with the possible exception of the construction of the Great Wall of China. And so it really is startling how bad the economics are. It makes no sense to do anything of this, but it's even worse than that, because it's only the Western countries that are still doing this nonsense. The rest of the world is paying absolutely no attention to this climate drivel, this gibberish. And so what is happening is our electricity prices in the West, as I say, are hugely higher than theirs, precisely because the communists of the East, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Russians, the Chinese, they are not doing this. Well, they're doing a little, because everybody knows that one day coal, oil and gas will run out. Oil and gas perhaps within 50 years, maybe 100 if you're lucky. Coal within 100 years, 200 if you're lucky. So we've all got to find other ways of generating electricity. But here's the killer. If you do this now and the rest of the world doesn't, you set yourself at what Ron Reagan and Margaret Thatcher would have recognized as what's called a terms of trade disadvantage against all other countries on the planet, particularly in the manufacturing industries, because it's just too darn expensive to make anything here, which is why everybody is getting out and going to China, India, not so much Russia because it's such an unpleasant place, but also Pakistan. They're all getting out of the West because in the Western countries, we now charge such absurdly large amounts for electricity, while telling the nation that, of course, wind power is so much cheaper than coal-fired power. It isn't. You can make it look cheaper because you can say, well, we've got various subsidies on it and we don't have subsidies on coal-fired power. So if you don't take any account of the subsidies, then the price that the coal operators would charge is higher than the price that the wind operators would charge, because the wind operators are subsidized, so they can charge less. But that's not a fair direct comparison. You compare it directly. Wind power is at least 3 or 4 times more expensive than coal-fired power. And in Britain, we've now shut down our last coal-fired power stations. It's completely idiotic. And they all had about 30 or 40 years more perfectly healthy life in them. So it's a real outrage that we are subjecting ourselves to this terms of trade disadvantage, which is a disadvantage that means we have structurally rearranged our electricity generation and also, of course, our locomotion, cars and trains. They now are having to be electrified. And that is hugely expensive, particularly for cars, because you have to ship the battery around inside the car. And how crazy is that? Because the battery increases the weight of the car by at least 30% compared with a real car, and up to double. And again, if I were to ask Walt Johnson, okay, so if we increase the weight of a car by double, if we take, for instance, the Ford 150, which I think is one of your most popular trucks, the Ford 150 with electric batteries in it weighs about twice what a proper Ford 150 with a vroom vroom engine in it will be. Then if it weighs twice as much, then to go a given distance at a given speed, you're going to consume twice as much energy just shipping the damn batteries around. So that makes absolutely no rational sense. And let's look at wind power. Well, that's even sillier, because once you get, as we have in Britain, beyond the point where the nameplate capacity of wind and solar power exceeds the total mean hourly demand on the grid, then any more wind and solar power will make virtually no difference to the amount of CO2 emitted by the grid. But it will do 2 really nasty things. It will greatly increase the cost of electricity, but it will greatly reduce the revenue that each individual wind farm operator gets, because they've got to share that revenue with more and more wind farm operators while contributing practically no extra electricity to the grid. So the economics of this are utterly horrendous. And no grid operator, no wind farm operator, no government has yet bothered to sit down and do any of the sums that I've just talked about in outline to you. None of what I've said is actually contentious. If you were to ask, once anyone sees the arguments and sees the figures, they say, well, why are we still trying to do this then? And the answer is because this is being driven politically. And if you want to see more about that, and you can get onto YouTube, if you Google the word Monckton, spelt as you see on the screen, and also the word Mises, which is M-I-S-E-S, then you will see an hour-long lecture by me, which will not only give you some of the scientific background and economic background, but it will also explain exactly how it was that, first of all, the KGB, or rather its successor, the FSB, they're essentially the same people, chose to exploit this issue. and also how the Chinese Ministry of State Security, which is their intelligence service, has more recently joined in the fun. And their agents of influence in the West are actively promoting this climate nonsense because they want to destroy the economies of the West. They want to take over the leadership of the world from the West. And most of the people who are advocating for, oh, we must do something to save the planet, are either useful idiots who have never had the chance because of the very heavy communist censorship of all forms of media now, electronic or legacy media. They're all virtually controlled by communists now, certainly communist dominated. So they never hear the other side of the story. Those are the useful idiots who've never bothered to inquire into this and find out, as I was made to do by that hedge fund, what the truth really is. Or a relatively small number of people, typically the people who run and organize so-called environmental groups. Very nearly all of them are now communist. Because in 1985, there was a meeting in Moscow of the KGB, as it still then was, the Disinformation Directorate. And they decided at that meeting they were going to capture the environmental movement. And by December of that year, they had captured Greenpeace, which ever since then has been nothing but a communist front. And I know this because I knew Lieutenant General Ion Mihai Pacepa, who had been the head of the Securitate, the secret police in Ceausescu's communist Romania. And he then came out to the West in 1978, as a direct result of which I was moved in to 10 Downing Street in 1979 to work with Margaret Thatcher to stop the miners' strike that he had been told would happen at the instigation of Moscow if ever a conservative government was returned. And so when Margaret Thatcher was returned, within 2 months, the leader of the miners went off to Moscow and spent 5 months there being trained, first in the Patrice Lumumba of University of Terrorism, and then in the Library of Communism, as it's coyly called on Wikipedia. It's actually the Lenin Institute. That is where they train the world's terrorist and communist leaders and then send them back to their countries to foment revolution. Scargill spent 5 months there, flew back on an Aeroflot flight to Paris. Scargill was the head of the miners who were striking, and he then led the strike a few years later. And we knew that he'd been trained in Moscow, and eventually we let one national newspaper know, and they published a little column. We said, don't make too much of it. And then we made sure that every mine worker in Britain somehow got to hear of that cutting from the Times. And then when the mine workers discovered that it was communists who were trying to destroy our energy system and had therefore funded the strike and trained their leader, the leader of their union, then they broke the strike. They were loyal to this country. The ordinary miners were not communists. The leaders always were, because the communists had captured them and they maneuvered the election, so the leaders were always communists. So I've been fighting this battle for a very long time, because when we defeated that strike in 1985, that's when they held this crisis meeting of the KGB. Now, what do we do to trash the Western economies? We can no longer use the trade unions. Somehow they found a way around it. They didn't know how I'd done it at that time. They know now, but they didn't then. So they decided the best thing to do was to capture the environmental movement. They'd already captured the anti-nuclear movement, which in those days was rather improbably led by a communist Monsignor from Westminster Cathedral. But they then thought, well, if we can do it to them, we can do it to the environmental movement. And I was talking to Dr. Patrick Moore, one of the founders of Greenpeace, who wasn't a communist. None of the early founders were communists. They were all true environmentalists. They actually cared about saving the rainforests and the whales and the polar bears and whatever. As they were not communists. But he said in December of 1985 was when the communists moved in and took over Greenpeace. And he said, I and many others like me, because none of us were communists, we were driven out and replaced by communists. And he's the one who told me, he said, this is now a communist front organization. You should not give it any money. You should have nothing to do with it. It is there for the sole purpose of destroying the Western economies. So that's the background to this. It's not just fumbling scientists getting it wrong. It is an organized campaign by the totalitarian states around the world. And one of the saddest things about this is that Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and now most of the Middle Eastern Arab countries, which are all Muslim dictatorships, they're not enlightened like the Abbasid dynasty in the old days, they are now joining forces in a grand totalitarian coalition. And their main objective is to destroy the free West, to get rid of the very concept of democracy. And their major weapon of destroying our economies now is the climate change narrative. So it's nonsense scientifically. It makes no sense economically. You can't do it anyway, because it may, even if you shut down the whole world's emissions, it would make virtually no difference to global temperature. And there's one more thing. You can't do it anyway. I got a phone call a few months ago from Professor Simon Michaud, who is the director of resource economics at a splendidly named organization called the Geologian Tutkimuskeskus, which is the Finnish Geological Survey. And he said, you may like to know, I've just completed a 1,000-page paper. He said, I've assumed that we take the climate extremists at their word, and we actually want to get to net zero by 2050. So I've sat down and said, okay, if we want to do that, these fancy windmills and solar panels, and in particular the batteries for electric buggies and also to back up the wind and solar, he said, the trouble with those is that they're not made of steel and concrete like a nuclear power station or a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power station. And they're not made of steel like a motor car. They're made of really rare and really expensive special metals known as techno metals. And he said, I thought, well, let's just look at what techno metals you would need. For instance, lithium. You've heard of lithium batteries probably. And you use either lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide, and that's the electrolyte inside the battery. It's highly inflammable, which is why if ever an electric car gets in an accident, it'll burn for 36 hours, however much water you put on it. It'll cause terrible damage. But anyway, you need these very special metals. And he sat down and said, well, all right, let's just to get one 15-year generation of net zero energy technology, then you've got to replace it again because they all wear out. It's not like a nuclear power station that goes on for 60 or even 80 years, or a coal-fired power station doesn't say, no, you get 10 to 15 years if you're lucky, and then you've got to do it all again, and you can't recycle these metals either. Very, very difficult. And so he said, how much of those would you need every 15 years to have a so-called net zero economy with a mix of nuclear, which doesn't need much of these, and then all these other fancy wind and solar and electric buggies? And he came to the conclusion that just lithium alone, you would need 10,000 years worth of the entire global annual output of lithium as it is today, just to provide one 15-year generation of net zero energy technology. 10,000 years, 9.5, I think was the exact figure. Copper, you need 180 years worth. And that's already shot up in price because everybody's using copper for everything nowadays. But then for the vanadium steel that you need in these battery casings, for instance, the vanadium, which is another of these rare metals, you would need 67,000 years worth of the entire global annual output of vanadium as it stood in 2019, just every 15 years. And there are about a dozen of these technometals, all of which have these very, very long timescales. Cobalt, I think 32,000 years. And there's absolutely no way that we can get to net zero emissions by using the technology that the communists are trying to foist on us, these windmills and solar panels, because there just aren't enough of the natural resources on which these things work. So net zero cannot be done anyway. But it gets worse, because even if it could be done, which it can't, and even if it could be done, it would be unaffordable. And even if it was affordable, it wouldn't make very much difference to global temperature anyway, because they've made this mistake. And even if they hadn't made the mistake, it still wouldn't make very much difference to global temperature. But then it is still utterly stupid for us to go ahead and install all these wind and solar and electric buggies at a rate that is very, very greatly faster than the rest of the world, because it means that buying a motor car, running a motor car, insuring a motor car is now twice as expensive in the West as it is in China or India or Russia or Pakistan. Twice as much, and sometimes 3 times as much. And the price of electricity, as we've said, is hugely more. So what you wouldn't do if you were a government running an intelligent policy on energy and climate and so forth. And if you still believed in this climate nonsense anyway, which now that we've discovered this mistake, you don't need to worry about it, because there will be a little warming, but it'll be net beneficial. But even if you still believed that global warming was a problem, then what you would do is you'd say, right, we will do this at the same pace as the rest of the world. And what will dictate that pace is not fear of global warming, because that isn't actually a problem. It is instead that in 50 to 100 years' time, there won't be enough oil and gas to go around. Within 100 to 200 years' time, there won't be enough coal to go around. So we're going to need nuclear power as the mainstay, because that can provide continuous power in the way that wind and solar can't. So if you want to keep the lights on all the time and make sure somebody's in the middle of an operation and the lights go out in the theatre because the sun's gone down, you don't want that happening. So nuclear is going to be the future of energy worldwide, but it's going to take time to develop the nuclear technology and get it to be more affordable and more reliable and safer, so we don't get another Chernobyl and we don't get another 3 Mile Islands and we don't get another Japanese one, if you remember when the tsunami came in and sank the power station there. And so we've got some work to do on getting nuclear to rights, but this research is now being done. But in the meantime, precisely because coal, oil and gas are so cheap, and precisely because they're not going to do very much damage anyway, let's use them while we've got them at the same rate as everybody else is continuing to use them, so that we keep our electricity and our transport and everything that depends on energy as affordable as the rest of the world. And we therefore stop pricing ourselves and our manufacturers in particular out of the international markets. Now, you can see if you're a communist and you wanted to destroy the Western economies, then it's much better just to get us to destroy it for ourselves by this climate narrative than it would be for them to go to war with us or send nuclear missiles or whatever. So that's what they've done. They've completely captured the schools and the universities. They're now essentially communist run. And what they're teaching to the kids just doesn't bear thinking about. And there are very few schools that are free of this now. They've really taken those over. And so the kids are being fed this utter drivel about climate change. But every time I meet a kid and I suggest to them, well, maybe there might be another side of the story, they look at me as I'm completely mad. And so I have a technique for dealing with smarty pants kids who think that because they're young, they know more than we do about this. And I simply say to them, they say, well, of course you don't know what you're talking about. I say, well, can you perhaps differentiate for me the Stefan Boltzmann equation and tell me what the Planck constant that is the result of that derivation, how that applies to determining how much global warming we may cause? And they go very quiet when they realize that they're up against a scientist who knows what he's talking about. So the trouble is, there's a lot of work now to be done, much more widely than just in the field of climate, if we are to preserve the West, because the indoctrination of school children and university students is now so intensive and so complete that they simply do not ever realize that there is another side to the story. And the sort of material that's on this podcast, if you tried to put this up on, let us say, YouTube, they would certainly mark it with one of their little context notices, which is a very mild form of censorship, but censorship it is, saying, this doesn't reflect the official point of view effectively. Or they would do what they did to my little channel when I first started putting up a video or two about this, and within 20 minutes of the video going up explaining this scientific error, the entire channel was shadow banned. They didn't even tell me. They shadow banned it so that anyone searching for my channel from within the YouTube search engine will not find it. So the censorship is intensive. They are determined that the truth on this climate question shall not come out. And that's why this podcast is so valuable, because the people who listen to this are going to hear the other side of the story, as virtually nobody else anywhere on the planet is now going to hear it.
Well, Lord Monckton, this is fascinating. Walt, I know that there were several things that you wanted to make sure that we included in this podcast. Is what else would you like to add on to this?
I think you included everything without asking. Thank you. As Ken Gregory in our documentary said, we need to do a very detailed cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
And we just talked with Ken again, and he never put into consideration the cost of putting up the additional electrical grid to haul all this stuff around. And he didn't include the cost of recycling it, or it isn't recycling, just getting rid of it. Anyway, so the cost is going up, and again, we've kind of come to the same conclusion you have, that the benefit is very minimal, but I don't hear much about it.
No, that you won't, because of course, the moment people understand that even if we were wrong about the feedback science that I described earlier, where they forgot the sun was shining, pretty basic mistake when you think about it, but supposing we were wrong about that, you're still only going to reduce the global temperature by 0.2 Celsius. It's a very easy calculation. What we've done, rather than trying to do a complex benefit cost analysis, the trouble with trying to do that is there are so many slippery variables that they can tweak to get any result they want. We had to find a simple and robust way of doing it that they couldn't deny. So the first thing we did was to work out how much, or rather how little, global warming could be prevented. And you do that we always use their data. So they can't argue about the data we've used. And what you do is you start with, there's a very useful thing which they now no longer maintain, ever since I started using it to show that we were making no difference with all our Western shutting down to save the planet. They stopped updating this, but it's still updated till about 2021 or 22, I think. And this was the annual greenhouse gas index, which was produced by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States. And they produced this very useful graph, which I took off their webpage and then enlarged on a PowerPoint slide, and then plotted in fact, it's very nearly a straight line, very nearly a perfect straight line, the increase in our influence on the climate, which is measured in units of what are called radiative forcing, in watts per square meter, if you want the units. And that has been going up continuously in a very near perfect straight line ever since 1990, which was the year of IPCC's first report on this, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which of course makes its fortune by trying to pretend that there's a climate emergency when it knows perfectly well by now that there isn't. So that straight line is at a rate of approximately 1/30th of a unit per year. So you can then work out very simply how many more units would there be between now and 2050. That's 25 years, conveniently, roughly now. So it's going to be, 25/30ths of a unit, which is 5/6 of a unit. And then you can work out from that what you'd have to do to change that. If you would save half of that if all countries started now and went in a straight line to net zero. So that tells you just this tiny, tiny reduction of kind of, a 1/12th of a unit or something over that period. Then you can work out what would that translate to in terms of temperature. And it's about 0.2 Celsius if we're wrong, 0.1 if we're right about the feedback argument. So this is a really simple way of doing it. And it's so robust that they won't be able to say, oh, that's too simple to be right, because these are the basic numbers you actually have to use. And then you go on to the cost side of it. And the way we do that is you start with this wonderful report of the grid, which simply said 3.8 trillion is the cost of just net zeroizing the British electricity grid alone. That's 1/4 of total British emissions is the grid emissions. That's the government's own published figure. So therefore, we know that's 15.2 trillion or whatever it is to just net zeroize the whole of the British economy, not just the grid, but the rest of it as well. We know that we are 0.8% of global emissions. And so we know what it's going to cost in the rest of the world as well, $2 quadrillion. That's how you work it out. And that's really robust. And it produces a much larger figure than any other cost analysis you'll see. But it's also a much more realistic one because it's based at its starting point on what it will actually cost, in the opinion of the UK's grid operator, to net zeroize just the UK grid. They know what it will cost, and they just sat down and worked it out. That report is becoming increasingly hard to find now because it's not what the present communist government wants people to know. But these are the very simple ways in which you can calculate this so that a high school kid can mimble his way through this and see that, yeah, it's a single, PowerPoint slide showing the whole calculation. And each step of the way, you can go and look up the references. There aren't very many that you need, and they're all official ones. And so then you can show people, and we're actually doing this at the moment with various governments around the world, we're showing them that none of this makes any sense. When I went to Russia at the invitation of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 2017, this was very interesting. They were having a climate conference organized by the Russian cities. And we were still talking to Russia in those days. They hadn't had the crazy notion of invading Ukraine by then. So I went, they paid my expenses and put me up in a nice hotel and so on. And I went and gave a talk to the conference, which was international. There were people from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the UN and all sorts of big wigs there. And I gave my talk, and there was a minder from the Russian Academy of Sciences who was watching very closely. And she saw, to her astonishment, that the young people, the teenagers in the audience, leapt to their feet when I'd finished speaking. And I went up to these teenagers afterwards. I said, why did you applaud when I said this was all based on a mistake? Because in the West, they're all propagandized into thinking there can be no mistake and this is settled science. And they said, well, we are taught here to keep a more open mind about things. And in any case, they said, yours was the only speech that gave us teenagers any hope for the future. And that's why we're really grateful that you came to Moscow. But then the minder said, oh, there's now going to be a high-level technical session led by the deputy chairman of the Russian Academy of Sciences, academician Semenyov. So we want you to come to that. So Semenyov opened this private sort of technical discussion for the world's leading climate scientists, plus me, on why it was that, given that it's long been predicted that, so they say, there'll be between 2 and 5 Celsius degrees of warming for every doubling of the CO2 concentration in the air, or 2 and 5 Celsius between the beginning and the end of the 21st century, because the two numbers are about the same. Why can't we narrow it? Why is it so wide a gap, an interval of range as 2 to 5 Celsius, 3 Celsius range, in which somewhere within there the global warming will happen? And so I waited for all the IPCC and all the senior representatives and professors from around the world to waffle into silence. And then I said, well, academician, I can tell you why it is. It's because you've made this elementary mistake of physics. It's right at the heart of all your computer models. It's right at the heart of all the calculations of how much global warming we may cause. Put that right, and then you can narrow it down. It's between 1 and 2 Celsius degrees. That's all it's going to be in the whole of this century. So don't worry about it. And then the debate went on to other aspects. But at the end of the seminar, Semenyov made a beeline for me and only me. And he said, come with me. So I went with him. And he said, here is Professor Mojib Latif, and he is the IPCC's representative at our conference. I want you to explain what you have just explained to us to him. And he sat and watched. And Latif was called away momentarily before I could get going. But he, as a parting shot before he went, he said, oh, well, I suppose we had better agree on the equation of climate sensitivity, which is the how much warming equation. And so off he went, and I, on a napkin, we were standing around one of these tables you have in these conferences. I scribbled 2 equations. So Latif came back, and I said, on the top one of these 2 equations is the equation of climate sensitivity that you use, isn't it? And he looked really disappointed that I knew it. He said, yes, that is the one we use. Yeah. But he said, what's this other one? I said, well, that's the corrected equation of climate sensitivity, which takes account, as yours does not, of the fact that the sun is shining. He said, what the heck do you mean? So I talked it through with him, and he could not answer. And Semenyov was looking like a hawk at both of us. He had never been so closely scrutinized representing an argument. He was absolutely fascinated. And he could see that I was confident, because my team had already by then been working on this for a couple of years. We knew we'd got this right. And Latif had absolutely never come across this before. He had no idea what I was talking about. So Semenyov got rid of him. He said, I tell you what, come with me. So then he introduced me to this little gnome-like figure who was the Russian chief climate model programmer. He sat there with his Coke and his donut. I'm just going to turn that off. I'm sorry. And he said, right, explain it to me. So I explained it to him, and literally within 20 seconds, he had completely understood the point, because he knew about feedback response and how it worked. He understood the equation. He said, oh my God, he slapped his hand to his forehead. And he said, I'm going to have to go at once. Please forgive me, academician. I must go. And he said, why? Well, I've got to go and reprogram the computer. We cannot allow this error to stand. And so he went off and reprogrammed the computer. And it's now the only one of the 30 or 40 big climate models around the world that doesn't predict too much global warming. It's within the range, it's the high end of the range, but it's within the range of the actual measured warming, because roughly speaking, the amount of warming they predict, which will happen over a decade, is 1/10 of the warming they think they would happen over a century. And so the amount of warming that's been happening over a decade should be, in their opinion, around 3 Celsius every 0.3 Celsius every 10 years, 3 Celsius over the century. And in fact, it's turning out to be more like 0.13, 0.15, that sort of thing, about half what they predicted as their mid-range estimate. And therefore, it's way, way, way below the high-end estimates of sort of 0.5 Celsius every 10 years or 5 Celsius over the 21st century, which is their high-end forecast on which all their policies are based. It's actually only half the mid-range forecast. It's right at the bottom end of their range of forecasts. And he understood that. And so his computer model now correctly predicts that it will only be 1 to 2 Celsius of warming over the 21st century. And it's the only one that gets it right.
Why don't they just start using his only?
Well, they can't do that, because if they were to get in touch with him and say, can you please explain to me why it is that your model is showing so much less warming than me, and say, well, Monckton told us you've got it wrong, and here's the mistake. And they don't want to go there, because they know perfectly well that we're right. Tell you another story, if you like. I was submitted the paper to, quite recently, this was last year, I think, to a very smart climate journal run by climate extremists. They're all communists. But it's managed by and is a journal of the university press of one of our leading universities. I'm going to spare its blushes by not saying which it is, because they'd be very embarrassed if they knew their idiocies were being exposed in this way. And it's not fair, while discussions are still going on, that they should be tortured by this. But they wouldn't, in the end, print the paper. At first, the editor said, well, actually, we've had a lot of discussions with the fellow editors. They're very interested in this paper. And yeah, we're going to have to look at it. And then they spent months on a series of rambling reviews, which were clearly designed to obfuscate the very clear issues in the paper, so that they could say, well, no, we don't think it's ready for publication, and we don't think you're right, and you've got this wrong, and you've got that wrong, all of which was bogus. So they wouldn't publish it. But at about the same time, a very eminent emeritus professor in the geology faculty of that university got in touch out of the blue. And he said, oh, your result is circulating among control theorists. And of course, we do quite a bit of control theory in geology, because feedbacks that alter the way rocks behave, we need to know how. So he said, I thought that what was told to me about your result must be nonsense. How could they have made so elementary a mistake? But I am curious. So will you come and give me lunch in the university concerned? And I will have a look at it, you see. So I went and gave him lunch, and I talked him through much the same way as I've talked it through with you. And he said, well, superficially, I can't see anything wrong. I could see this as an argument that if all the various aspects check out, that would stack up. So he said, I want to see the paper. So I sent it to him, and the very next day he got in touch and he said, I read this paper. The logic of it is impeccable. And he said, it must be published. And I said, well, good luck with that. They're trying not to publish it. So he waited a bit, And then he had me again for lunch a couple of times so I could explain more. Eventually he said, look, I want you actually to go right through this paper. And so I sat him down at his kitchen table and we went through it. Took an hour and a half to the paper, all the annexes, all the supplementary material, all the references. So he knew everything about it. At the end of that, he was exhausted because he's quite an old man now, older even than me, which is saying a lot. And so he said, well, I'm going to write to the Vice Chancellor of the university, who is the head by ex officio from the nature of her office of the people who run the university press. And I'm going to tell her this must be re-reviewed because they've clearly not understood it. Because I'd sent him all the reviews as well, so he knew exactly what the journal had said about our paper. He said that the reviews are clearly nonsense. They've clearly been made up to make it look as though they're reviewing it properly, but actually they're not. So he wrote to the Vice Chancellor, who is married to one of the most prominent advocates for the global warming nonsense in the whole of Britain. He's a professor of it, and he's very extreme. And she described him in her opening speech to when she became the Vice Chancellor as a climate warrior. So in her own words, he's a climate extremist. So the professor said, why don't you show this to your husband? And if he can't tell you it's wrong, then get back to me and we'll, perhaps you'll arrange for the university press to re-review it. You see. So weeks went by without reply. So he wrote again. And weeks have gone by. It's now 3 or 4 weeks since he wrote again. Still no reply. Now, an eminent professor who in his field of geology is world class. He knows more about plate tectonics than anybody else that's ever lived, and is still contributing papers on the subject at the age of 87. And he turned 87 earlier this year. And he is got a bit between his teeth now. The fact that she hasn't replied, and hasn't replied twice, to one of the most senior emeritus professors at her university, that's a very serious abuse of research practice. So if she doesn't reply, he's then going to write to all the delegates, as it's called, of the university press. And he's going to say to them, your chairman ex officio, the Vice Chancellor, has twice been written to about this and has not even had the decency to acknowledge my letter. So I'm now writing to all of you. And if within 1 week I do not receive a reply from any of you on behalf of all of you, then I am going to raise this as a formal complaint of an abuse of research practice by the entire university press and by the Vice Chancellor of this university. And if that ever goes public, this university's name is going to be mud internationally. So that's the next step. So what we're doing is we're using the sort of ghastly socialist procedures that every university is now hedged about with. In this case, the procedure for the handling of complaints about research integrity, to use their own procedures against them and say, right, you have behaved in a manner which is plainly dishonest and we're not having it. And you've then tried to duck out of it by not replying to an eminent professor's letter asking you about this. We're not having that either. And then, if even that comes to nothing, there is a further and final phase where we go to the police and we say, here is, in effect, climate change is the largest fraud in human history. Here is what an eminent professor did to try to stop one corner of that fraud. And here is what happened. And this university is now a fraudulent university. It is now pursuing a communist agenda, contrary to the interests of this country, contrary to the scientific truth. And there's nothing he can do to get them to put it straight. So now this university and its university press and its vice chancellor and all the delegates of the university press are all guilty of fraud, in that they are presenting themselves in their journal as having academic integrity, and they don't. And we've even gone through the complaints process, and they still don't. And this is fraud. So we nick them for fraud. And then if the police say, well, we can't really prosecute, it's all too difficult for us, they drag their knuckles along the ground, then we say, right, as long as you give us a clear explanation of why you and what's called the Crown Prosecution Service decline to prosecute for this plain fraud, then we, once we have that document from you, are entitled by law to pursue our own private prosecution of the university and all of its people for fraud. So that will be the final stage of this. And once that fraud trial happens, then the arguments that I've been putting to you will be put in front of a jury over a period of several days. So they'll have time to look at all the numbers and see how simple it is to work out how little, I mean, you could just look at the graph and see how little effect all the trillions already spent on global warming have had on the rate at which our influence on global temperature is increasing. It's increasing in an absolutely straight line. Nothing that's been spent has made any difference at all to that. And that's because once you correct for this scientific error, our effect on the climate is so tiny that it's not likely to change in either direction, whichever we do. And so this is something you can explain to even a jury of ordinary folk who have no particular mathematical knowledge. You can just say to them, well, look, this is how simple it actually is. And you can explain the point to a jury again. Look how simple it is that they forgot that the sun was shining. And if you put the sun into the equation, then, hey, it all works out. And you get, it's quite interesting, you actually get, because between 1850 and 2020, we know exactly how much influence on global climate we are thought to have, because these are published figures, and it's more or less exactly equal to the effect just of doubling the CO2 in the air. Now, we haven't doubled the CO2 in the air, we've increased other greenhouse gases and so on, so it comes out to the same. And we know how much warming there was up until 2020. And if you apply our formula to that, corrected for the fact that the sun is shining, you get exactly the amount of global warming that's actually happened since 1850. If you use theirs, there should have been twice as much warming since 1850 as there has been. And they can't explain that, but we can. So you can explain this to a jury and they will be left, however much the other side tries to flannel and confuse them, they'll be left in the end having to say, actually, this does look like a fraud. And once one entity like this has been found guilty of fraud in connection with this central error and the surrounding economics and resource allocation and so forth, that's it. The whole thing will collapse like a house of cards. So step by painful, patient step, we are encircling this university, its vice chancellor and its university press, and the journal and its editors and their reviewers. And all of them will find themselves in the dock charged with fraud, unless they start treating our paper honestly. And if they come back to us and say, right, we've reviewed it properly, and there are the following real errors, which mean your argument doesn't work. If they're right about that, then okay, it's a fair cop. But they haven't done that yet. They produce a series of bogus arguments, which in the opinion of the professor, who's looked at them as an independent third party, who started out not thinking we were right, he says their arguments against us do not hold water. So, we can now get this done fairly by using eminent people like that professor and getting them into court and testifying that what we're saying is in fact correct. And then that leaves the fraudsters going to prison for what, in the words of the late Professor Nicholas Merner, the great expert on sea level, who said sea level is barely going to rise in the next 100 years, he said this is the biggest fraud in human history, this climate change nonsense. Those were his words. I first came across him, there's another nice story, when I was doing a debate against the climate communists at St Andrews University, which has a very fine debating society in Scotland. After the Durham Union and Cambridge and Oxford Union societies, it's the best one in Britain. And we were invited there, and I'd never met Merner before. And the president of the union was a student, said as we went in, he said, you do realize that 98% of this audience is going to vote you down, don't you? And I said, yeah, sure, we don't mind that. And Nicholas Merner said the same, no, we don't mind that. The truth is the truth. However many few profess to believe it, it's still true. And we'll still speak it until somebody silences us and says to them, speak the truth no more. And so the student was startled. He said, well, most people here would be terrified if they had to speak to so hostile an audience. And then Professor Merner made one of the most brilliant speeches I've ever seen. He'd been lecturing to students by that stage for 50 years or so. So he knew absolutely how to charm a student audience. He did it brilliantly. He was eccentric, he was funny, but he got the points home and rammed them home one after another. And as a direct result of that brilliant speech, We won the debate by about 6 votes, I think. Totally unexpected. I mean, the president of the union was absolutely horrified. He said, "How did you do that?" I said, "Well, that's the great thing about the truth. All you have to do is tell it. And if you have somebody as brilliant as Nicholas Merner telling it, then people are going to notice." That's all we did. And they never asked us back, of course. But the great thing was that that's where I met Merner. And he has written 600 papers on sea level in his long career. He's now Mary in heaven. He died a couple of years ago, very sadly. But in those papers, he said we might expect 2 to 6 inches of sea level rise over the whole of the 21st century. You know, it just wouldn't go over the top of your shoes. It's just nothing. And so far, he is being proven correct, and all the extremist predictions the IPCC has had to revise downwards its predictions of sea level rise in each of its last 5 assessment reports. And you never see that fact reported in any Marx Stream news medium.
Well, Lord Monckton, this has been so fascinating. And to your point, the truth is so important. And that's why this film, Walt Johnson, what you have put together with a climate conversation, is so important. And I thank you for your vision on that. And Dave O'Rourke, how would you like to wrap this up?
Well, with gratitude, of course, for this remarkable gentleman that we've had the pleasure to be with today. I will predict that the future watchers of this podcast are going to be sorry that we had to end it and that it could go on, but it can go on. This conversation can go on. You can find a wealth of material from Christopher on the internet. You will have to search for it. Go fight through the shadow banning, find it on page 20 of your Google search, but it's there.
But the other thing, remember that phrase, Monckton Mises. So Monckton spelled as on screen, and Mises, M for mother, I-S-E-S. He was a German economist, and I was speaking at Oxford. He was from the Austrian school, actually, and he was a free market economist, and they have a society in his honor. Of course, I'm a free market economist, having worked for Margaret Thatcher. And so he, the chairman of the institution, asked me to give a lecture, in fact, at Oxford. And all the communists turned up, as well as the von Mises people. And they were horrified to find the strength of the arguments. And they were even more horrified when at the end of the talk, I told them exactly who was pushing this global warming nonsense in the West. They didn't want me to know that, and they still less wanted me to tell anybody else that. And that video, despite the censorship on YouTube, if you type in the words Monckton Mises into the search engine inside YouTube, you will find it straight away. And it's had, I think, 200,000 hits now, which for a skeptical video is in these days exceptional. I mean, before they really began the heavy censorship, I was getting 3 to 5 million hits for a video on YouTube. Now, 200,000 because of the censorship, but that's still fairly considerable. So a lot of people are gradually getting to hear the truth. And they're beginning to realize, you can see from the comments there, that most of them do realize that what they're hearing is the truth, because the argument is so very simple.
Well, thank you, Lord Christopher Monckton. This has been fascinating. Dave O'Rourke, as our spokesman for a climate conversation, keep up the great work. Walt Johnson, you had no idea what you were creating when you decided to put together a little film, and it started around your kitchen table.
Thank you. With you at it.
So be sure and check out climateconversation.com for the movie and all of these podcasts. And Lord Monckton, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. And once again, remember, Monckton Mises, M-I-S-E-S, and you'll be able to see that, the more long presentation, which shows you the slides and gives you a little bit more background on the mathematics, the economics, the resource economics, all the things you've heard here. You'll be able to see it in more detail there if it amuses you. And it'll help to show the censors at YouTube that their censorship isn't working.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Thank you.